The night air hung thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement and the greasy aroma of fried food wafting from the roadside diner. Claire adjusted her apron, stifling a yawn as she balanced a tray of half-empty coffee cups. It was nearing midnight, and the diner had mostly emptied out, save for the regulars and the occasional drifter looking for a hot meal before disappearing back into the night. She had been working at Hank's Diner for almost a year now, saving up tips to escape this tiny town that had nothing to offer beyond long shifts and empty promises. But tonight felt different. There was an unease prickling at her skin, a sense that something was off. The hum of the flickering neon sign outside seemed louder than usual, and the low chatter of customers didn't drown out the distant roll of thunder. Then the door creaked open and he walked in. A man, tall, thin, and dressed in an old, tattered coat that looked like it had seen better days. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, and as he moved toward a corner booth, Claire caught the faintest glint of his eyes. Something in his stare made her stomach tighten. He slid into table 9, hands resting on the laminated menu without so much as a glance at it. He didn't take off his hat, didn't shake off the rain that clung to him, just sat there motionless. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to approach. "Good evening. Can I get you something to drink?" Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The man's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "Coffee. Black." She nodded, scribbling it down, eager to step away from his gaze. Something about him made her nervous. Maybe it was the way he sat so still, or how his fingers twitched every now and then as if resisting the urge to move. As she turned, she caught Hank, the owner, staring at the man too. His normally gruff expression was pinched with something close to fear. When their eyes met, he gave her a slight shake of his head as if to say, "Don't ask." Claire busied herself behind the counter, pouring the coffee, but she could feel the man's eyes on her, burning through the space between them. When she returned with his cup, he finally spoke again. "You have very kind eyes," he murmured, voice rough like gravel. Claire froze for half a second before forcing a polite smile. "Thank you. Can I get you anything else?" He didn't answer immediately, just took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving her face. Finally, he set the cup down with deliberate slowness. "No. This will do." She left the table as quickly as she could without seeming rude. Even as she took other orders and chatted with the regulars, she could feel him watching. Minutes passed, then an hour, but he never moved, never asked for a refill. Just sat in that same rigid position, fingers tracing slow circles on the table's surface. Then, without a word, he stood up, pulled out a crumpled bill, and placed it beneath the coffee cup. He adjusted his coat, turned toward the door, and left. The moment the door swung shut behind him, Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Who was that?" she asked Hank, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank's expression was grim. "Nobody you want to know." She frowned but didn't press further. Instead, she walked over to clear the table. That's when she noticed the bill he had left behind. It was a 20, old and wrinkled, but something about it made her pause. The ink seemed off. The texture too rough, almost brittle. And then she turned it over and saw the words scribbled in shaky handwriting on the back. "I see you." Her pulse jumped. A cold wave of dread swept over her, making the tiny hairs on her arms stand on end. She looked around, half expecting him to be standing just outside the window, grinning at her through the glass. But the street was empty, the night thick with mist rolling in from the highway. Shaking off the unease, she stuffed the bill into her pocket and finished her shift. It was just a note. Just some weirdo passing through town. She would forget about it by morning. But she didn't. Because as she walked home that night, the feeling of being watched never left her. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, always a half step too slow to be her own. Every time she turned, there was nothing there, just darkened houses and the empty road stretching ahead. By the time she reached her apartment, her nerves were frayed. She double-locked the door, checked the windows twice, and tried to convince herself it was all in her head. Then, as she reached into her pocket for her keys, she pulled out the 20. The note was gone. In its place, a single, small Polaroid. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned it over. It was a picture of her. Taken from behind. Taken tonight. The edges of her vision blurred as fear clawed up her spine. Hands trembling, she dropped the photo, backing away as if the image itself could hurt her. Then her phone buzzed in her pocket. A new message from an unknown number. "Nice to see you home safe, Claire." Her blood ran cold. And then came the knock at the door. Claire's trembling fingers hovered over her phone, her breath shallow as she stared at the message. The air in the apartment felt too thick, suffocating. Outside, the city hummed with distant sounds, cars passing, footsteps on the sidewalk, but inside the silence was deafening. Then another knock. Soft, rhythmic. A chill crawled up her spine as she forced herself to step forward. With slow, careful movements, she peered through the peephole. At first she saw nothing, just the dimly lit hallway stretching out in both directions. Then movement. A shadow shifting at the edge of the hall, just beyond the flickering light. She took a step back, pulse pounding in her ears. Whoever they were toying with her. Then her phone buzzed again. "Why don't you invite me in?" Her knees nearly buckled. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to type a reply with shaking hands. "Who are you? What do you want?" The response came instantly. "I just want to talk, Claire. Let me in." Then from the other side of the door, a voice. Oh, smooth. "Let me in, Claire." Her blood turned to ice. Claire's breath hitched as the voice drifted through the door. It wasn't loud, nor was it pleading. It was calm, expectant, as if the stranger already knew what she would do next. She stumbled backward, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. The lock on the door seemed fragile, barely a barrier between her and whatever was on the other side. Her phone buzzed again. "You can't ignore me forever." She couldn't breathe. Her fingers trembled as she typed back, heart hammering against her ribs. "What do you want?" This time the response took longer. The dots danced on the screen, and she could almost feel the weight of the silence pressing against her ears. Then finally the reply appeared. "You served me." Her stomach twisted. The diner. The man at table 9. Memories flashed. His unmoving stare, the way Hank had looked at him with something close to fear. The $20 bill, the message scrawled across it. "I see you." Something wasn't right. Something about that night, about him. Then another text. "Check your window." Her entire body went cold. No, she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't play his game. "Check your window, Claire." Her body moved before her brain could argue. As if possessed, she turned, dread clawing up her throat. The blinds were half open, revealing the darkened city street below. But as her gaze shifted, she froze. There. Across the street, beneath the pale glow of the flickering street light, stood a figure. Tall. Motionless. Even from this distance she knew. It was him. Her phone buzzed again. She couldn't look away from the window as she reached for it with trembling hands. "You shouldn't have looked." Then the streetlight blinked out. Darkness swallowed the figure whole. A sound escaped her lips, a breathy, fractured thing, part gasp, part sob. She stumbled back, pulse roaring in her ears. Her phone slipped from her grip, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The apartment was too quiet. The hallway outside was too quiet. And then, as if the world had been holding its breath, a new sound. Not a knock. A slow, deliberate scraping just outside the door. Fingertips dragging along the surface. Exploring. Waiting. Her body was locked in place, her mind screaming at her to run, to hide, to do something. Then, silence. A void of sound so complete it made her ears ring. She swallowed, willing herself to move. One step back. Then another. She needed to get to her bedroom, to barricade herself inside. Call the police. Do something. Her foot barely touched the ground before a sharp, metallic click. The lock. Claire's heart stopped. The handle twisted. The door creaked open. A figure stepped inside. Tall. Thin. A tattered coat still damp with rain. And beneath the brim of his hat, a smile. Took you long enough to let me in? The scream caught in her throat. The lights flickered. The apartment plunged into darkness. And Claire was never seen again.